Welcome to the Shadow People, the full story. Sit close. Let me tell you why I started collecting these stories in the first place. I had lived a long life, seen more than most, and yet there was a shadow that lingered beyond explanation, one that could not be dismissed as imagination. People would tell me their experiences, hushed and wary, fearful of ridicule or disbelief. I learned quickly that what they called shadow people were not a product of dreams or fear alone. They were something else entirely, and their presence, though subtle at first, was undeniable. The first sightings were always the quietest, the kind that slipped past the conscious mind. A movement in the corner of an eye, a fleeting silhouette in the bedroom doorway. Sometimes it was as simple as the faint pressure of awareness that someone or something was there, even when the room was empty. I remember a man from northern Scotland, a shepherd, who swore he saw a dark figure standing at the edge of his field as dawn broke. Animals scattered before he could even raise his eyes. That, he said, was the first real moment he understood he was not alone. Then there was the Hat Man, which many of you have surely heard whispers about. A tall, indistinct figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, always just beyond the edges of vision, usually in rooms where people slept. He appears suddenly, sometimes silently observing, sometimes moving closer when the sleeper awakens. One account from the Midwest described a woman waking to find the Hat Man standing at her bedside. She could not scream, she could not move, and she felt only the silent weight of those eyes, though she swore she could not see them clearly. It was the first detailed case that made me understand the figures weren't random tricks of light. They were persistent, patient observers. And some encounters were not visible to humans at all, at least at first. Animals notice first. Dogs growl at empty corners, cats arch their backs and hiss at air no one else sees. In one village in Norway, a farmer reported his chickens huddling together in fear, staring into an empty barn corner. He laughed, then froze as he saw a shadow detach from the wall, stretching toward the flock. He ran, but the image remained burned in his mind. Such stories are everywhere across continents. Some call it instinct, others call it folklore. But these animals perceive before we can. Then there are those who wake paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Sleep paralysis has been written about for centuries, and I will explain it only once, clearly. It occurs when your body is caught between sleep and wakefulness, leaving your mind aware while your muscles remain immobile. Many shadow people encounters are reported during this state, but the experiences are not limited to paralysis. The Hat Man, dark silhouettes, and figures at the foot of the bed appear, sometimes moving closer, sometimes whispering words that linger in memory. The terror is real, and yet there is a strange order to it, a method beneath the madness. And just as suddenly as these early sightings occur, they vanish. No sound, no trace, no explanation, except for a lingering sense that something has been watching. People whisper of corners of rooms where shadows shift oddly, of shapes seen only in reflections, never captured fully by cameras, and of moments when the presence feels closer than the walls themselves. Each story is different, yet the patterns emerge. The figures appear, they observe, and they disappear, always leaving questions, rarely answers. But these early sightings were just the beginning. What I discovered next made me realize that these things were not random, not imaginary. and not bound by the laws we believe govern the world. After those first sightings, patterns began to emerge. I collected letters, diaries, and first-hand accounts from people who had never spoken to one another, yet described nearly identical experiences. One woman in Germany described seeing a shadow at the foot of her bed for 3 nights in a row, always receding when the light touched it. Across the Atlantic, a man in Ohio reported the same. A dark figure that appeared when he least expected it, never speaking, never moving toward him, yet leaving an undeniable presence. These accounts, scattered across the globe, suggested more than coincidence. They hinted at a presence aware of those it observed. The Hat Man appeared often, yes, but not alone. Some witnesses described figures that hovered just beyond recognition, silent and featureless, always at the edge of perception. They were more than tricks of the mind, for some left tangible effects. Books knocked over, doors closed on their own, cold drafts passing through rooms with no apparent source. Children, especially, seemed to sense them first. A little boy in Japan spoke of men in the dark who watched him while he played, yet his parents saw nothing. Such sensitivity in children may explain why folklore is rich with these figures, often warning, often teaching, always observing. Animals, as before, were reliable indicators. Dogs would bark frantically at nothing. Cats would hiss at thin air. In Africa, a farmer described his cattle clustering in the corner of a pen, fixated on a dark shape invisible to his own eyes. Hunters in remote forests report the same. The wildlife reacts first, giving us clues before we can comprehend what lurks just beyond sight. The shadow people seem to respect instinct, or perhaps they feed upon hesitation and fear. Either way, the animal kingdom perceives them long before humans do. Sleep paralysis, as I said, is a window. People are trapped between states, yet conscious enough to observe, and yet, even awake, many report shadows slipping into their peripheral vision, never fully seen, never fully captured, always eluding cameras or recording devices. A young man in New England set up multiple cameras in his bedroom for a week and captured only brief streaks of darkness, blurred and indistinct. Others describe the sensation of being watched, a pressure on the chest, whispers they cannot remember fully, but linger in memory. These experiences are universal, recurring in ways that defy simple explanation. And so, the first encounters are rarely violent. They are subtle, methodical, and patient, observing the unwary, noting the sensitive, and disappearing before understanding can form. Yet each account, when pieced together, shows a deliberate presence, one that chooses moments carefully, waits, and leaves only traces. But these early glimpses were only the surface. The deeper stories, those that revealed why they come and why some survive while others vanish, that's where the true terror begins. Once you notice a shadow person, you cannot unsee it. It lingers at the edges of perception, a weight in the corner of your mind. One of the earliest reports I received came from an elderly couple in rural Scotland. They awoke to find their living room rearranged, furniture slightly moved as though a presence had walked through while they slept. No doors had been opened, no windows disturbed. They told me later that what frightened them most wasn't the movement, but the sense that they had been watched the entire time. And it is not merely domestic spaces. Travelers report figures along roads, in forests, even in airports. In Canada, a trucker described a shadow at the edge of a foggy highway, standing perfectly still, watching as he drove past. When he looked again, it had vanished. In the United States, a hiker in the Appalachian Mountains swore he saw a tall, dark figure standing at a crossroads, not moving, yet somehow following him with its presence. These are not isolated phenomena. They are consistent, recurring, and yet impossible to fully capture. There are few who encounter more than one type. Some speak only of the Hat Man, others of shifting, featureless shadows that twist along walls, dissolve, and reform. A handful of individuals describe fleeting interactions with shapes that mimic human forms, yet move unnaturally, in ways that make your mind question reality. Some leave marks, scratches, disheveled objects, even faint impressions on the floor. Others whisper, though the words cannot always be recalled. It is as if memory itself fears to commit what has been seen to permanence. And though these accounts are unsettling, it is the patience of the shadows that terrifies most. They appear, observe, and disappear. They do not attack in anger, nor strike in malice. They merely note, record, and wait. In my research, I found that the longer someone notices a figure without fleeing or screaming, the more intense subsequent encounters become. Observation seems to fuel them, or perhaps it is their way of teaching, testing, or warning. The first encounters are deceptively simple. They lull you into thinking the phenomena are harmless glimpses or tricks of the mind. But as stories pile upon stories, a pattern emerges. These sightings, these small, fleeting moments, are pieces of something far larger, something ancient, something deliberate, something that watches and waits for reasons we cannot yet comprehend. But these early sightings were just the beginning. What I discovered next made me realize these things weren't random, and that some who encountered them would never be the same again. Once you've seen them once, you start noticing patterns. It is not random where they appear. Some places seem to attract them, as though the land itself whispers their presence. Old crossroads, abandoned hospitals, forests with tangled paths, even cities built on layers of history, these are their favored grounds. Travelers have long spoken of crossroads as liminal spaces, where the world bends slightly and the line between here and elsewhere becomes thin. Shadow people are drawn to such points, hovering at thresholds where humans might hesitate, reflect, or fear. Across the globe, these patterns are remarkably consistent. In Europe, a small village in Germany reported nightly visits from featureless figures in the narrow alleys and dark corners of centuries-old homes. In North America, a cluster of incidents emerged in abandoned mills and train stations, spaces where time and memory accumulate. In Asia, particularly in Japan, children reported seeing men in the dark at the edge of forest paths or temple thresholds. Each story, though culturally unique, shared one element. The figures always appeared at a point of passage, a threshold, a place between spaces or states. Thresholds are not always physical. They can be moments of transition, waking from sleep, walking between rooms, or even moments of emotional vulnerability. The shadow people seem to sense hesitation, fear, or heightened awareness. They appear when perception is most acute, when the mind is slightly unbalanced, when the soul, if you will, is most receptive. One account from an English boy describes seeing a dark figure in his bedroom doorway precisely as he was deciding whether to flee to his parents' room. Another, in rural Canada, recounted a shadow that appeared just as he stepped from the safety of his cabin into a fog-shrouded path. There are also rules, though few can understand them fully. They do not cross certain lines, do not enter some spaces without purpose. Hospitals, especially older wards, are frequent sites, as are libraries, schools, and places where time and attention concentrate. Children notice them first, often unafraid, unshaped by adult logic. Adults may feel a chill or see movement in the corner of an eye, but rarely comprehend the full scope. The young, however, often speak of whispers, of shapes observing silently, of figures that vanish when directly confronted. And these rules seem consistent across continents. Cultural variations differ. Jinn in Middle Eastern tales, the old hag in the British Isles, Kage-onna in Japan, but the behaviors are strikingly similar. They watch, they linger, they appear at the edge of thresholds and then vanish before comprehension catches up. The patterns emerge slowly, but once you begin noticing, it is almost impossible to ignore. Then I met someone who claimed they could communicate with them, and what I learned from that encounter changed everything I thought I knew about these watchers. The stories I collected made one truth unmistakable. Children perceive what adults cannot. A 5-year-old girl in Japan described a tall figure standing at the edge of her tatami room, whispering words she could not fully understand. Her parents saw nothing. A boy in Norway told me of a shadow hovering just outside his bedroom door during the long winter nights, always still, always waiting, yet never approaching too close. Adults often see only a flicker, a shadow in the corner of a room, or feel a subtle pressure on their chest, but children sense the presence fully, without fear holding them back. Perhaps innocence makes them more attuned, or perhaps they are less burdened by disbelief. Across cultures, these figures take on different names, yet their behavior remains consistent. In the Middle East, they are called jinn, beings that exist on the threshold of human perception, neither wholly good nor evil. In the British Isles, the old hag is reported in sleep paralysis accounts, a silent observer pressing on the chest of the sleeper. In Japan, Kage-onna or Kuroko shadow women appear along thresholds, sometimes whispering warnings, sometimes remaining distant. Even in Africa, tales of the Tokoloshe describe dark, featureless figures that haunt children and travelers alike. Though each culture adds its own flavor, the underlying traits are the same. They appear at edges, they observe, and they vanish before understanding can take hold. And then there are the rules. Though we cannot fully understand them, they seem to respect thresholds, doorways, corners, crossroads, and avoid direct confrontation unless provoked or invited. Observers note that attempts to chase or capture these figures are often futile. They vanish, shift, or appear elsewhere, leaving the observer questioning their own senses. Timing matters. They often appear at moments of indecision, fear, or emotional vulnerability. Those who notice them most clearly are often sensitive to light, sound, or subtle shifts in the environment. Geography also plays a role. Shadow people are rarely reported in uniform patterns. Instead, clusters appear in areas with layered histories, abandoned structures, or places steeped in energy or memory. In some rural European towns, entire households reported nightly visits over decades. In American cities, abandoned hospitals and old schools are frequent sites. Children, again, are disproportionately aware, able to perceive details that adults miss. A figure standing still for hours at a hallway's end, or shapes flickering along walls during the quietest hours of night. The more I pieced these accounts together, the more I realized that these beings follow an internal logic. They observe, they test, they measure perception, but never randomly. Every appearance has timing, every shadow has intent, and every whisper, every fleeting glimpse is a lesson. Patterns emerge only when the stories are viewed together, across continents, centuries, and generations. And then I met the one who claimed she could speak with them, and what she revealed changed everything I believed about how these shadows operate. The woman who claimed she could communicate with them was unlike anyone I had met. She lived in a small village in northern Italy and had experienced encounters since childhood. Unlike most, she did not react with fear. She spoke softly, describing the figures in detail, noting their movements, their choices, their apparent intelligence. According to her, the shadows were not merely watchers. They were aware, capable of response, and sometimes, just sometimes, willing to convey messages. She explained that communication was subtle, never direct. A shift in the corner of the eye, a brush of air, a whisper too quiet to catch consciously. Some messages were warnings. Avoid this place. Do not sleep alone. Prepare yourself. Others were more cryptic, almost like puzzles, meant to test patience or observation. She said the figures recognize fear, hesitation, and confidence alike. The braver the observer, the more complex the interaction became, and always there was a lesson embedded, though not every observer survived or remembered it fully. Children often had similar interactions, though their awareness was untainted by disbelief. One boy in Scandinavia described shadow figures that spoke to him using gestures, patterns of movement, and whispers that only he could hear. They guided him, tested him, and eventually vanished when they deemed the lesson complete. Adults rarely received such clarity. Most only experienced fleeting glimpses or sensations. A hand on the shoulder, a door closing softly, objects displaced, or a shadow reflected incorrectly in a mirror. Even with these accounts, patterns of behavior persisted. Thresholds mattered. Time of day mattered. Certain structures, particularly those with deep history or layered human activity, were more likely to host encounters. The figures observed, waited, and only engaged when perception was acute. In many cases, attempts to force interaction only led to frustration or increased anxiety. They are deliberate in their appearances, methodical in their choices, and precise in timing. And so, as the patterns emerged, one truth became unavoidable. These beings were more than superstition, more than folklore. They were a consistent presence across space and time, obeying rules humans did not fully understand. They had a purpose, a method, and perhaps a plan that spanned decades, centuries, or even longer. The woman's account was the first hint of this, a glimpse of intelligence behind the shadows, a subtle acknowledgement that what humans observe is only a fragment of a far larger reality. Then I found records of encounters that went further than observation, further than messages, into places and events that no one could explain. And that's when the story became truly dark. Once you realize they are aware of your presence, the encounters shift. They are no longer fleeting shadows at the corner of your vision. They become participants in a delicate dance of observation and response. I have collected countless accounts of people who tried in their own ways to communicate with these watchers. Some attempted simple gestures, waving, speaking, even asking questions aloud. Few received anything in return, but those who did describe experiences that were impossible to ignore. One man, a librarian in Massachusetts, left notes in the hallway of his apartment building asking the figure to respond in any way it could. For nights, nothing happened. Then, a pen left on the floor in his hallway had been pushed into a strange arrangement, letters forming what he swore were words, though he could not interpret them fully. Another, a woman in South Africa, reported a shadow moving objects in her home, books, chairs, even a teacup, to mark patterns or communicate warnings. She said it was as though the figure wanted her to notice carefully, to learn patience, observation, and respect. Physical contact, though rare, is reported often enough to be notable. Scratches on arms, light touches on shoulders, cold hands brushing against clothing. These are common elements in eyewitness accounts. A man in Canada described waking to find his sheets tightly pulled around him as if the figure had moved silently through the room. Another in Germany recounted a mirror reflecting a shadowy hand that seemed to point toward a corner he had never noticed before. These manifestations are subtle but deliberate, as if to remind the observer that presence itself can carry meaning. Messages are almost always cryptic. Whispers, faint and fleeting, appear in moments of silence. Some are warnings. Do not enter the room tonight, or prepare yourself. Others hint at more complex lessons, sometimes testing the observer's perception. A young girl in Japan described sequences of shadows moving across her walls, forming shapes and patterns that conveyed a story she could not fully describe. It is as though the figures measure awareness itself, gauging how deeply a person notices, remembers, and interprets. Even technology has been a conduit. Cameras, audio recorders, and simple photographs occasionally capture anomalies. A dark streak across a hallway, an indistinct form hovering in a doorway, or a flicker of movement that defies explanation. Yet, as always, these captures are partial, fragmentary, leaving the observer with more questions than answers. The intelligence behind these actions is apparent. The figures are deliberate, testing human tools as much as human perception itself. But the most remarkable and the most unnerving cases were those who claimed to see multiple types of shadows at once, interacting in ways that no one could predict. And what I found next in the records would shock even the most skeptical of minds. Some observers have reported seeing more than one type of shadow at a time, not simply a repetition of the same figure, but distinct presences, some tall and thin, others shorter and wider, some with hints of movement that seemed almost human, others more animalistic, slinking along walls or corners. One witness in Ohio described 3 different shapes appearing in sequence, each interacting differently with the environment. One moved objects, one whispered faint warnings, and the third simply observed, its form shifting in ways he could not describe. People who experienced such multiplicity often reported a heightened sense of awareness, as though the shadows were testing their perception. Some attempted to respond, speaking aloud, waving hands, or placing objects in certain positions. The responses they received varied, sometimes subtle shifts, sometimes inexplicable alterations to the environment. A photograph might capture only a streak, a blur, or a shadow cast where no object existed. A recording might pick up faint sounds, unidentifiable and fleeting, like whispers carried on the edge of hearing. There were those who received messages directly though not in words as we understand them. A young woman in France reported seeing symbols appear in the corner of her vision, shapes forming and dissolving on the walls, leaving her with an uneasy understanding of warning or guidance. Others described sequences of knocks, taps, or light touches, communicating with rhythm rather than language. These interactions are rare, but when they occur, they suggest intelligence and purpose beyond mere observation. Objects moving, shadows interacting, whispers and signs. Each encounter confirms the presence is deliberate, aware, and capable of response. Yet even those who received such communication rarely understood the full meaning. The messages are fragmented, testing, layered, and always leaving questions that linger long after the encounter ends. People report dreams afterward, images that seem connected to the event, or premonitions they cannot explain. The figures do not speak directly to everyone, but for those who notice, the awareness is profound. Technology, though sometimes helpful, rarely captures the full experience. Cameras pick up anomalies, yet shadows appear differently on film than they do in the eye. Audio recordings capture fleeting whispers but cannot preserve their essence. Some researchers have noted that the more aware the observer, the more pronounced the interaction becomes, as though the figures adjust to perception itself. And always, there is a deliberate patience in every action, a testing of the mind, a probing of awareness, a quiet insistence that the human cannot fully understand. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the old asylum records, where the shadows seemed to step out of history itself, leaving marks that no one could explain. The asylum records were unlike anything I had seen before. Rows of old documents, patient journals, and staff notes described figures moving through halls, silent and observing, with no clear explanation. Nurses recorded unexplained drafts, doors opening and closing, shadows appearing in peripheral vision, and patients speaking of beings that whispered warnings or gave cryptic guidance. One record described a patient who swore the figures moved objects to protect him from harm, but only him. Another mentioned multiple shadows interacting, shaping their environment in ways no single person could orchestrate. Even the staff, trained to dismiss imagination, could not deny the reports. Entries mention objects displaced, faint scratches appearing on walls, chairs repositioned without explanation. One night, a nurse observed a dark figure at the end of a hallway. She approached, and the figure vanished into the wall itself. She described the chill that followed, the feeling of being watched even after the figure was gone. Many dismissed these accounts, but the consistency across decades, across patients and staff, was impossible to ignore. There were stories of warnings delivered directly. Patients would awaken to find notes they had not written, messages scrawled with trembling handwriting in margins of journals. Others described objects moved into meaningful positions, symbols appearing on walls, or sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. The asylum, with its long corridors and quiet nights, became a nexus where multiple types of shadows manifested, interacting not only with individuals but with one another, almost as if they understood the architecture itself. Even the most skeptical researchers began noting patterns. Certain wards, especially those built over older foundations, had more frequent sightings. Patients with heightened sensitivity, children, or those in moments of emotional vulnerability reported the clearest experiences, and some accounts hinted at awareness, almost intelligence. The shadows reacted to attention, curiosity, and caution. They were not mindless figures. They observed, measured, and adjusted according to the responses of those around them. The interactions at the asylum confirmed what I had feared. The shadow people were not random. They were deliberate. They were aware. They could communicate in ways subtle and profound with those who noticed, and the records hinted at something darker yet. They were capable of influencing human behavior, shaping perception, and leaving traces that lingered long after the immediate experience ended. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered next in the history of these shadows, a past that stretched back centuries, and perhaps even longer. To understand the present, you must first see the past. These shadows are not a modern phenomenon. They have been whispered about for centuries, long before electricity or cameras could capture them. Medieval chronicles, journals, and even court records contain vague but chilling descriptions. Figures that appeared at the edges of perception, moving silently through villages, towns, and even castles. Sometimes they were called omens, messengers of death, or spirits of the restless dead. Other times, they were dismissed as tricks of the light or fevered imagination. In England, an account from the 1600s describes a family plagued by a dark watcher at the edge of their hearth. They swore it moved objects and whispered warnings, though neighbors saw nothing. In France, abbots noted figures appearing in monastic corridors, silent and observing, only visible to those who were awake at unusual hours. In Japan, ancient temple records mention kuroko, shadow figures that would appear in corners, seemingly aware of human activities, sometimes guiding novices, sometimes simply watching. Across continents and centuries, these stories show striking similarities. Governments have long been aware of such phenomena, though rarely publicly acknowledged. Military records from the early 20th century describe incidents during night patrols where soldiers reported unexplained figures in forests or along strategic locations. Hospitals, research stations, and isolated facilities noted shadows appearing in hallways, sometimes moving objects or influencing patient behavior. Most records were filed away, dismissed as anomalies, or quietly destroyed. The pattern suggests an awareness that these entities exist, and that their presence may have consequences humans are ill-equipped to understand. Missing persons cases often intersect with these reports. In England, several villagers disappeared near places where recurring shadow sightings were recorded. In the American Midwest, farmers reported neighbors vanishing, only to find their homes disrupted in subtle, inexplicable ways. One account from a remote monastery describes a monk walking alone through the cloisters, only to vanish entirely. Witnesses later described shadows lingering where he had been. Patterns emerge, hints of connection between the shadows and those who never return. Mental institutions, too, bear witness. Patients reported repeated interactions with these figures, sometimes warnings, sometimes threats, sometimes guidance. In some cases, staff noted that individuals who claimed to see these shadows often had accurate premonitions about events that would occur within the facility. It is as if the shadows were not only observers, but collectors of knowledge, testing perception, and perhaps selecting individuals for reasons beyond human comprehension. Then I discovered testimonies from people who claimed to have been taken, and what they described was beyond anything I had imagined. Some of the earliest accounts suggest that governments and military organizations were not entirely ignorant of these phenomena. Files recovered from obscure archives hint at investigations into unexplained sightings and persistent shadow entities. Soldiers patrolling forests or abandoned towns reported figures at the periphery of vision, always observing, never aggressive, yet their presence was undeniable. Some documents describe measures to track or contain these entities, though most plans were abandoned after repeated failure. The intelligence behind the shadows was unmatched. They could anticipate human behavior, evade detection, and vanish when pressure was applied. Missing persons cases are often intertwined with these reports. In the American Midwest, a series of disappearances along isolated roads coincided with multiple sightings of featureless figures. A farmer's wife in Missouri noted the same shadow visiting their barn repeatedly before her husband vanished without a trace. In Europe, travelers reported being followed by dark shapes along forest paths, only to find themselves disoriented, sometimes missing days or returning with no memory of the hours that had passed. Each case carries a thread of the same pattern: observation, interaction, and sudden removal from the known world. Hospitals and mental institutions tell similar stories. Records describe patients claiming to have been taken by shadows during the night, returning hours or days later, forever altered. Some spoke of strange rooms, strange lights, and corridors that seemed endless. Others described a feeling of time stretching or contracting, moments that lasted decades or mere seconds. Staff who observed these patients often noted uncanny accuracy in recollections of events that occurred elsewhere, as if the shadows imparted knowledge or experience during these encounters. And then there are reports of deliberate collection. Certain individuals seemed singled out, observed over weeks or months, with objects subtly moved around them or messages delivered in ways only perceptible to the chosen observer. A letter from a man in Russia described shadows arranging his tools each night, guiding him toward certain tasks, but never interacting when he tried to force attention. It is as though they are methodical, patient, and purposeful, not random, not chaotic. Their aim is beyond our understanding, yet unmistakably intentional. History shows us that these encounters are consistent, persistent, and often dangerous to those unprepared. They do not merely watch, they engage, select, and sometimes remove. The past centuries are littered with hints of their influence, from ancient villages to modern cities, and always the accounts leave us questioning our understanding of reality itself. Then I discovered testimonies from those who claimed to have been taken, and what they described was something no one would ever forget or survive unscathed. The testimonies were chilling beyond measure. People who claimed to have been taken spoke of being pulled into spaces that did not follow the normal rules of the world. Corridors stretched endlessly, walls bent and shimmered, and light behaved strangely, as though reality itself was altered. Some recalled feeling watched constantly, though no figure was ever near enough to touch. Others described shadowy forms moving alongside them, guiding or observing, yet always just out of reach. It was as if the very laws of physics were adjusted to accommodate their presence. A woman in Italy described being drawn from her home during a storm, waking to find herself in a corridor lined with indistinct figures. They did not harm her directly, she said, but their observation was suffocating, and she felt compelled to act as though every step was under scrutiny. Hours or what felt like hours passed, yet time was distorted. When she returned, only minutes had elapsed in the outside world. Others described similar experiences in remote hospitals, forests, and abandoned buildings. Each story contained an echo of the same reality. These beings existed in parallel, following rules we barely grasp. Some of the abducted returned with fragments of knowledge, hints that the shadows were not random in their appearances. Patterns emerged in their selections. Sensitive individuals, those who noticed thresholds, children, and those with acute perception were most often chosen. Objects were moved, environments subtly altered, messages delivered in whispers, gestures, or small arrangements. Those who survived often bore marks, physical scratches, impressions, or lingering sensations of observation. Many described the encounters as tests, trials, or lessons, though the purpose remained mysterious. Even more troubling were accounts of those who did not return. In scattered records across Europe, North America, and Asia, disappearances coincided with shadow sightings, sometimes leaving rooms disrupted, furniture moved, and walls marked with scratches or impressions. Local authorities often dismissed these events, labeling them missing persons cases or accidents. Yet the common thread, the presence of shadowy figures, remained consistent. Observers, survivors, and records all suggested a deliberate, patient, and highly intelligent presence behind these occurrences. The past, as revealed in these accounts, leaves a warning. The shadows are not new, and they are not random. Their history is long, their intelligence profound, and their motives unknown. What we know is fragmented, pieced together from testimonies, journals, and records, but the pattern is clear. Those who encounter them are forever changed. Those who ignore them may still be observed, and some are chosen for reasons we can scarcely comprehend. Then I discovered the first-hand accounts of abductions, people who entered a space no human should enter and returned only partially themselves. And what they revealed would change everything I thought I knew about these watchers. What I am about to tell you is not for the faint of heart. Some who have encountered these shadows report being pulled from their world entirely, snatched into realms that resemble our own, yet twist and distort in ways impossible to describe. A man in rural Ohio awoke to find himself standing in his kitchen, yet everything was subtly wrong. The angles of the cabinets were off, the light behaved strangely, and the air felt heavy, almost alive. Shadows moved along the walls, observing, guiding, and sometimes retreating into corners that seemed to stretch endlessly. These abductions are often disorienting, not violent. People describe being carried through spaces that defy the normal rules of time and geometry. One woman in Scotland recounted a corridor that seemed to extend for miles, though she was certain it was only her home. Another, a teenager in Japan, spoke of waking in her room only to discover days had passed in the outside world, though she remembered moments that felt like years. It is as though the shadows manipulate the very fabric of reality, bending it to a form that suits their observation or testing. Mirror worlds are common in these accounts. Reflections appear distorted, sometimes showing figures that are not present in the room. A man in Germany reported stepping toward a mirror, only to see his reflection replaced by a tall, featureless figure that mimicked his movements with subtle delays. Those who tried to interact found that the figure anticipated their every action, moving in ways impossible to replicate naturally. The experience left him disoriented, and he noted that even small objects in his room had shifted when he returned to normal perception. Time behaves unpredictably during these encounters. Survivors often describe moments stretching or contracting, sensations of déjà vu, or periods when minutes feel like hours. A woman in Canada recalled stepping into her hallway, seeing a shadow across the far wall, and when she looked again, an entire night had passed. Objects moved, whispers occurred, and subtle signs appeared to indicate presence and awareness. Those who have experienced this repeatedly often report that the shadows are methodical, deliberate, and patient, measuring perception, patience, and response. And though these experiences are terrifying, they are rarely violent in a traditional sense. The danger lies in the unknown, in the impossibility of fully grasping what occurs, and in the profound disorientation that follows. Those who survive report a lingering sense of observation, the feeling that the shadows continue to watch, waiting for the next threshold, the next moment of vulnerability, or the next opportunity to interact. But the most frightening accounts were those who did not return the same, or at all. And what I discovered next made me question whether anyone truly understood the rules of these realms. Some who return from these experiences are not quite themselves. A man in Poland described being pulled into a space where time seemed fluid. He witnessed events that had not yet occurred in the outside world, yet they felt real. Shadows moved around him, silent and deliberate, as if orchestrating the flow of moments. When he returned, only hours had passed in reality, but his memory contained days, sometimes weeks, of events he could not explain. Mirror worlds are particularly deceptive. Several witnesses describe rooms that mirror their own homes, yet everything is slightly altered. Doors lead to nowhere, windows reflect landscapes that do not exist, and figures move independently of physical laws. A teenager in Italy recalled a reflection in a mirror that did not mimic her movements exactly. It would pause, tilt its head, and linger where she was not. She said the experience left her feeling both terrified and fascinated, as though the figures were teaching her to see in ways she never had before. Time distortions are common, and they vary. One woman in Canada reported being outside her home for what seemed like a few minutes, only to return and find a day had passed. Another in Japan described events that felt like years compressed into a single moment, with shadows moving along walls and whispering messages she only partially understood. These distortions are not chaotic. They are deliberate, structured, and often paired with observation, as though the figures measure perception itself. Some who escape entirely carry knowledge, clues, or warnings. They speak of rules that the shadows follow, thresholds, attention, and timing. Certain places, certain moments seem to trigger these abductions more frequently. Old corridors, crossroads, abandoned buildings, and moments of heightened emotional vulnerability. Survivors often report that repeated exposure leads to patterns. The shadows test patience, the ability to perceive details, and the courage to confront what is seen. Objects often shift subtly during these encounters. Books, tools, or furniture may move just enough to suggest a presence, but not enough to confirm it directly. Whispered words, too soft to catch at first, are sometimes understood only in retrospect, and always the watchers are patient, deliberate, measuring how humans respond, learning, observing, and sometimes communicating in ways that are subtle but meaningful. But the most disturbing accounts were those who barely escaped reporting not just observation, but the reason behind the surge in sightings. And what they revealed was far more terrifying than anything I had imagined. The most unsettling discoveries came from those who barely escaped. A woman in the United States described being drawn into a space where shadows moved with purpose, guiding her through rooms that warped like liquid. She felt time stretch and compress around her, objects shifting subtly as if to communicate, to warn, or to teach. When she finally returned, only moments had passed in the world outside, but she carried knowledge that would haunt her for life. These beings were appearing more frequently and not at random. Reports from across the globe echoed the same pattern. A man in Norway found himself outside his cabin, observing shadows lining the tree line, their forms fluid but deliberate. A child in Japan described multiple figures moving in sequences almost choreographed in a corridor that should have been empty. Survivors spoke of being tested, challenged to perceive, to notice, to endure. Those who failed, they whispered, were left behind, their absence noted in ways the world seldom recognized. Time itself seemed to bend in these realms. Some returned with recollections of moments that stretched into decades or compressed into minutes. They described spatial anomalies, hallways that extended impossibly, staircases leading to nowhere, rooms that changed with every glance. Shadows manipulated these spaces deliberately, as though the environment itself was a tool to gauge perception, patience, and awareness. Survivors often sensed lessons hidden in the distortions, though the meaning was rarely clear at the time. The reasons behind the surge in sightings remain speculative. Some suggest that dimensional barriers are thinning, that human perception is expanding, or that the watchers have grown more active in response to changes in the world. Whatever the cause, the accounts are consistent: increased encounters, more elaborate interactions, and a rising intensity in observation. Those who survive often emerge changed, alert, cautious, aware that a simple glance, a hesitation, or a whisper could bring the shadows closer. And you must understand, these beings are not malicious in the traditional sense. They are deliberate, patient, and intelligent, measuring, observing, and occasionally interacting. But their purpose remains hidden, their methods obscure, and their increasing presence in the modern world is a warning, one that demands awareness, respect, and caution. But after decades of collecting accounts, the most alarming discovery was that modern times have made them more visible. And what I learned about their acceleration changed everything I believed. In the past few decades, something has changed. Encounters with these shadows are no longer confined to isolated corners, remote towns, or forgotten villages. Reports flood in from cities, suburbs, and even places previously untouched. Sightings are more frequent, more elaborate, and more consistent across the globe. People see them in broad daylight, in homes, on streets, in forests. No place seems safe from their watchful presence. Technology, it seems, has made them more visible. Cameras, smartphones, and surveillance devices capture anomalies that were once invisible to the human eye. Videos show fleeting figures, dark forms that slip through hallways, appear in mirrors, or linger at thresholds. EMF readings fluctuate, sensors detect inexplicable movements, and photographs reveal streaks and shadows where none should exist. The watchers are aware, deliberate and seemingly unconcerned by our attempts to record them, yet technology has made fragments of their activity undeniable. Statistics tell a worrying tale. Reports have increased exponentially year over year across continents. Researchers compiling sightings find patterns in timing, location, and even environmental conditions. Certain dates, certain atmospheric conditions, and specific structures seem to invite their presence. Thresholds, doorways, hallways, staircases remain significant. Public and private spaces alike have become arenas where the shadows test awareness, perception, and reaction. Shared experiences have become more common as well. People report encounters in groups, simultaneous sightings, and collective recognition of events that defy explanation. A group of hikers in Scandinavia described multiple figures moving along their path, each observer noticing slightly different details but agreeing on the essence. A deliberate, intelligent presence measuring their reactions. Online communities now discuss such experiences, piecing together patterns and comparing anomalies, though official acknowledgement remains scarce. The acceleration is not random. The watchers respond to attention, to observation, and possibly to changes in the human world itself. Some speculate that dimensional barriers are weakening, allowing more interaction with our reality. Others suggest increased human perception or collective consciousness makes them more visible. Whatever the reason, the modern surge is undeniable, and the consequences of inattention or disbelief may be more severe than ever before. After decades of research, I realized that this acceleration was no mere coincidence, and the reason they are appearing now is far more unsettling than I could have imagined. The more we observe, the more patterns emerge. Modern technology, while capturing fleeting evidence, also seems to influence the watcher's activity. Some witnesses report that turning on cameras, phones, or recording devices appears to provoke a response, a shift in movement, a slight delay, or a ripple across the room as if the shadows are aware of being observed. Others note that sudden attention, intense focus, or heightened fear seems to draw them closer, revealing forms that vanish when one blinks or looks away. Mass sightings have become more frequent in recent years. Schools, offices, and apartment complexes report multiple observers seeing the same phenomenon simultaneously. A factory in Germany described shadows moving along the perimeter of the building, with several workers noticing them at different angles. Each description differed in detail, but was unmistakably the same presence. These shared experiences suggest awareness of multiple observers, an intelligence that accounts for perception and adapts accordingly. Environmental triggers are evident. Certain locations, long hallways, staircases, isolated corners, or areas of emotional intensity invite their presence. Some believe low light, reflection, or spatial thresholds amplify visibility. Others suggest the figures respond to collective consciousness or stress in human populations. In each case, subtle interactions occur. Objects shift, whispers resonate, and patterns emerge that hint at an underlying intelligence. Some survivors report that repeated exposure reveals lessons. Patience, attention, and subtle observation are tested. Mistakes may result in objects moving unexpectedly or a shadow retreating into darkness, only to return later. The acceleration of sightings seems tied to human behavior, our curiosity, our fear, our growing awareness. The watchers are deliberate, methodical, and increasingly active, and the patterns they leave behind are puzzles meant to challenge perception itself. After 60 years of collecting accounts, I finally understood what they want, and it was not what anyone expected. After decades of study, patterns became undeniable. The watchers are not mindless. They are aware of the world they observe, deliberate in every movement, and intelligent in ways we scarcely comprehend. Modern life, with its lights, electronics, and constant observation, has made them more visible. Cameras capture fragments, sensors detect anomalies, and multiple witnesses report simultaneous encounters. But these glimpses reveal only part of their activity. An incomplete story, as much hidden as seen. The acceleration is linked to awareness. The more people notice, the more active they become. Groups of observers often report coordinated movements, shadows shifting in ways that suggest intelligence rather than randomness. Some who study patterns suggest that they are testing perception, probing human reactions, and learning from responses. Fear, curiosity, and observation seem to influence their actions, amplifying the subtle lessons they leave behind. Survivors of repeated encounters often develop heightened sensitivity. They notice the flicker of movement, the subtle whisper of air, the way shadows pool in corners. Objects may shift deliberately. Patterns may appear in light and reflection, and subtle changes in environment indicate presence. The watchers measure and they adapt. What was once hidden at the edge of perception now moves into the realm of awareness, pushing humans to see more clearly or risk missing vital signs. Understanding their purpose is difficult. Some suggest observation alone drives them. Others propose a more complex agenda, collecting, testing, or even communicating in ways we cannot yet interpret. The acceleration, however, is clear. More sightings, more interactions, more evidence that the watchers are becoming active on a scale never before seen. And the implications are troubling. After 60 years, I finally understood what they want. And it was something I could never have prepared for. What I discovered next would reveal the truth behind everything. What I am about to tell you is the culmination of decades of observation, research, and first-hand accounts. The shadows are not random. They are deliberate, patient, and intelligent beyond anything we fully grasp. Every corner they appear, every whisper, every object shifted, is purposeful. Over the years, I have pieced together fragments from testimonies, historical records, and modern sightings to form a picture, a truth that is as unsettling as it is elusive. The watchers select targets based on awareness. Children, sensitive individuals, and those attuned to subtle shifts in their surroundings are most often observed. They seem to measure perception, patience, and response. Every encounter carries a test, a warning, a lesson, or a trial of understanding. Those who fail may suffer disorientation, disappear, or return altered. Those who notice but do not panic are sometimes left with fragments, clues, warnings, or knowledge. The connection between fear and presence is undeniable. Fear sharpens perception, but it also invites closer scrutiny. The shadows feed not on terror alone, but on attention, awareness, and the human response to being observed. When fear is met with calm, curiosity, or deliberate observation, the interaction changes. Patterns merge, movements shift, and sometimes messages are delivered. The watchers communicate in subtle ways, through objects, whispers, shifts in environment, and the bending of time and perception itself. Historical accounts confirm this intelligence. From medieval villages to modern cities, patterns remain consistent. Deliberate observation, selection of sensitive individuals, and subtle manipulation of environments. Military and government awareness hints at acknowledgement of their existence and intelligence, though details are scarce. Missing persons, abduction survivors, and repeated encounters all point to a force that is patient, deliberate, and highly intelligent. Modern acceleration, child, only confirms what I have long suspected. Technology, collective awareness, and changing human perception have made them more visible. Shared experiences, group sightings, and online documentation reveal patterns, thresholds, and rules. The watchers adapt, learn, and respond. Their presence is growing, and their purpose, while still not fully clear, is no longer entirely hidden. What I learn next would finally reveal the purpose behind their watchfulness, and it was something no one could have expected. The watchers do not appear randomly. Their attention is focused on those who notice thresholds, patterns, and subtleties in the world. They study perception itself, our ability to see, to understand, and to respond. Individuals who are alert, observant, or emotionally attuned are more likely to attract them. The shadows test, measure, and sometimes guide, always patient, always deliberate. Some survivors report that certain behaviors influence interaction. Awareness without panic seems to lessen immediate interference. Observing, noting, and remembering details often brings insight. Objects shifted or arranged subtly are not threats. They are messages, guiding the observer toward understanding. Whispered warnings, reflections that move differently than expected, and patterns in light and shadow all convey meaning to those willing to notice. Fear is a double-edged sword. It sharpens senses, but also invites closer scrutiny. The watchers seem to thrive on observation combined with tension. They do not hunt in the conventional sense, yet their presence is impactful. Those who attempt to confront them directly often find that the shadows anticipate, adapt, and shift in response. The intelligence behind every movement, every shift in space is extraordinary. Historical accounts align with these observations. From ancient villages to modern urban centers, the same behaviors draw attention. Records of missing persons, abductions, and repeated sightings confirm that the watchers select carefully. Their patience spans years, sometimes decades. Observations may be spaced across lifetimes, always building toward some unknown purpose. Some survivors claim understanding fragments of this purpose. The watchers are measuring humanity, testing perception, and perhaps preparing for a broader shift in awareness. They are not mindless predators. They are deliberate observers, and their growing presence in modern life suggests a reason that is only partially revealed to those who endure encounters. And after seeing the patterns for myself, I realized that the methods people have been using to protect themselves were only partially effective until I discovered the approaches that truly work. People have whispered about protection for centuries, but most of what they pass around is superstition. Salt, iron, candles, prayers, none of these frighten the watchers. They observe them the same way a scientist observes a child stacking blocks. The old remedies were never designed for the shadows themselves. They were meant to calm the people who used them. But over the years, a few patterns emerged. small behaviors that seemed to limit how close the watchers approached. Not foolproof defenses, more like boundaries. And boundaries, those matter more than weapons. The first is awareness, not panic, not overreaction, simply paying attention. The watchers tend to withdraw slightly when someone notices specific details: the shift of weight, the angle of a silhouette, the rhythm of movement. It's as if recognizing the pattern forces them to adjust their approach. The second is order. People who keep structured environments, tidy rooms, consistent routines, predictable paths, report fewer close encounters. It's rumored the shadows find it harder to manipulate surroundings when everything has a clear place. They prefer to work in uncertainty. Reduce that, and you reduce their influence. The third is stillness, not freezing in fear, but controlled calm. When a watcher moves closer, those who slow their breathing, lower their heart rate, and hold their posture steady report the best outcomes. It's the opposite of what instinct tells you to do. Yet something about that calm forces the watcher to hesitate. And then there is the fourth rule, the one almost no one speaks about, because it's the only one that has ever been described as effective instead of merely helpful. Survivors say that when you focus not on the shadow itself, but on the space behind it, something changes, as if the watcher loses cohesion, like its outline struggles to hold shape. No one knows why. Perhaps their form depends on anchoring themselves to attention. Perhaps they require the observer to concentrate on their silhouette. Or perhaps that space behind them is where they truly exist. But the most unsettling accounts come from the ones who claim that after using these techniques, the watchers didn't disappear. They simply stepped back, not defeated, not driven away, just reconsidering, almost as if they were evaluating the observer differently. These survivors describe a peculiar sensation afterward, a feeling that they've been marked, not negatively, but selected. As if they passed some test the watchers administer quietly, patiently, over a lifetime. And that brings me to the final truth, the one none of the books mention, the one the old families whispered only behind closed doors. The watchers don't focus on everyone, just the ones who might someday see them clearly. And once someone finally sees them for what they really are, the watchers change their behavior entirely. What they do next is the part people fear most. Once a person truly sees the watchers, not just glimpses, not just guesses, but sees them for what they are, the pattern of activity changes in a very specific way. The reports from different eras match almost perfectly, even from people who lived continents apart and never knew of each other. The watchers stop observing from afar. They stop hiding in corners. They stop pretending to be silhouettes. They become direct. The first sign is subtle, a shift in your sense of time. People describe moments that feel slightly stretched, like a breath taking longer than it should, or a sound echoing too softly. This isn't supernatural nonsense. It's perception being nudged, adjusted, tuned, as if they want to see how a person reacts when reality bends just a little. Then comes the second stage, proximity. Not touching, not harmful, just near. The shape appears where it has no reason to be, at the foot of your bed, beside the staircase, standing motionless behind a half-open door. These appearances aren't random. They're placed, deliberate, almost instructional. They are testing how much the mind accepts before it breaks. The third stage is what survivors fear most, the silence test. The watcher appears in a place where you should not logically be able to ignore it. No corner, no dim light, no trick of the eye. And yet it does nothing. It waits. People who pass this stage all describe the exact same impulse, not to scream, not to run, but to remain strangely composed, as if some part of them understands that reacting violently gives the watcher something it wants. The ones who remained calm say the silhouette slowly stepped backward until it blended with the dark, neither threatening nor fleeing, almost respectful. The ones who panicked, their accounts never remained consistent. Gaps in memory, missing hours, rooms shifted, objects misplaced in ways too deliberate to be accidents. It's as if the watchers decide how much a person is allowed to remember. But there is one more stage, the final one. Few have ever described it clearly, and those who did were never the same afterward. Those people saw the watcher without the shadow. Not the silhouette, not the outline, the thing behind it. Their descriptions never match except for one detail. The shape behind the shadow had depth, too much depth, more than the room could contain. A wrongness that did not fit into 3 dimensions. And when they perceived this, the world around them flickered as if their mind had glimpsed a layer of existence it was not designed to handle. That is when the watchers stop being judges. That's when they become interested. And that brings me to the last encounter I had, the night I saw what stands behind the shadow. The night I realized why they've been watching me since I was a boy and why they've started watching you. Child, you've been patient through all this, and you deserve to know why I began speaking tonight. It wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't fear, it wasn't even the need to warn you. It was because they're back. I hadn't seen one clearly in almost 20 years, not since your grandmother passed. But 3 weeks ago, just after midnight, the house shifted the way an old ship groans before the sea changes. The air tightened. The lights dimmed, not flickered, just settled lower, like something in the room was absorbing more than its share. I knew that feeling. I'd lived with it as a boy. And when I turned, I saw one standing in the hallway, not lurking, not perched in a doorway, standing in the open, watching me as if I'd kept an appointment I didn't remember making. It was tall, but not unnaturally so. Shoulders slightly forward, head angled like someone studying a painting. No eyes, no face, just the shape. But the silence around it felt heavy, like the room was waiting for something important to be said. I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I simply breathed and said, "It's been a long time." And it nodded. Not a deep nod, not human body language, just the slightest downward movement, enough to prove it understood, enough to show it recognized me. The shape stepped forward once, slow but purposeful, and the floorboards didn't creak. It cast no shadow of its own. It didn't glow. It was simply there, in absolute defiance of what should be visible. The air changed again. A pressure built around my ears, not painful, just undeniable. The same pressure people described in the old asylum records, the precursor to a memory shift. So I focused hard. I held on to every detail. I didn't let the moment slip. The silhouette lifted an arm, smooth, controlled, and pointed toward the living room, toward the old cabinet where I keep my journals. Every encounter, every interview, every truth I've collected over 60 years. It was telling me something, Not a threat, not a warning. An instruction. I said, "You want me to pass it on?" The pressure eased. The silhouette lowered its arm. Then it turned, not like a person, not with weight or momentum. It simply pivoted, flat and silent, and walked toward the far wall. Not to the door, not down the hall, straight toward the wall. And it didn't disappear. The wall folded around it the way darkness folds when you close your eyes too fast. A soft ripple passed through the plaster, almost like breath. Then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, listening for footsteps or whispers. Nothing came. But the meaning was clear enough. They aren't watching me anymore. They're watching someone else, someone they believe might understand more than I ever could. Someone younger? Someone they've chosen. You. This is why I've told you everything tonight. Not to frighten you, not to burden you, but to prepare you for the moment, your moment. When the silence deepens, the room grows still, and you realize you're not alone in the dark. Because after all these years, after all the research and warnings and disappearances, everyone sees one eventually, but only a few are seen back. And child, they've already started watching you.